Here is the complete story in one continuous cinematic narrative, with the emotional twist and satisfying ending you requested. The day Calder Whitmore cheated on his wife, he believed he had finally found a woman who could give him the life he thought he deserved. He had no idea that before the sun went down, the woman he betrayed would quietly discover everything, and before the next morning arrived, he would learn the most painful truth of his life: the mansion he lived in, the company he bragged about, the cars he drove, and the fortune he believed belonged to him had never truly been his. It had all belonged to his wife. If you believe that kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, because sometimes the person we hurt the most is the person who loved us when we had nothing. Calder had spent 11 years convincing himself that he was the reason his family was successful. He walked through the marble halls of their estate with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him respect. He owned tailored suits, drove expensive cars, attended private business gatherings, and shook hands with powerful people who knew his name. Whenever someone praised his success, he accepted the admiration without hesitation. He rarely mentioned his wife, Elowen Whitmore, even though she had been beside him long before anyone knew his name. Elowen was gentle, intelligent, and quietly ambitious. Unlike Calder, she never needed an audience. She preferred working behind the scenes, studying financial reports at their home office, visiting their charitable foundation, and personally checking on employees who were struggling. To the outside world, she appeared to be a wealthy man's quiet wife. What almost nobody knew was that Elowen had inherited a substantial family trust before she married Calder, and over the years she had transformed that inheritance into a vast investment portfolio and a network of companies that eventually became the financial foundation of everything Calder proudly displayed. When they first met, Calder had been a struggling young salesman with more confidence than money. He had worn the same gray coat through an entire winter and often counted coins before ordering lunch. Elowen had never judged him for it. She saw something in him that he had not yet learned to see in himself. She helped him finish a professional course, introduced him to people who could help his career, and quietly invested in the small logistics company he wanted to build. She never demanded that he repay her. She never reminded him where the money came from. When the business began succeeding, she encouraged him to take the credit because she believed his confidence needed room to grow. Unfortunately, that confidence slowly became arrogance, and gratitude gradually disappeared. The first signs had been small. Calder stopped asking Elowen about her day. He began spending longer hours at business lunches and conferences, even when there was little business to discuss. He became irritated whenever she questioned his decisions. When she reminded him to visit his aging mother, he accused her of controlling him. When she suggested they spend a weekend together, he said she was becoming boring. Elowen noticed the changes, but she did not immediately accuse him of anything. She hoped there was something deeper happening, something they could repair if she gave him patience. Then came Vivian Hart. Vivian was a sophisticated marketing consultant who had recently begun working with one of Calder's companies. She was charming, confident, and fascinated by wealth. She noticed the expensive watch on Calder's wrist, the driver waiting outside his office, and the authority with which employees responded to him. Calder enjoyed being admired. Around Vivian, he felt younger and more important. He began hiding messages, inventing meetings, and returning home with explanations that became less believable every week. Elowen discovered the truth on an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had gone to Calder's office to leave documents for a foundation project. The office was quiet because most employees were attending a daytime corporate event across town. As she entered, she noticed a folder lying open on his desk. It contained a hotel reservation and 2 tickets for a private weekend trip. The reservation was under Calder's name, but the second guest was Vivian. Elowen stood completely still. For several seconds, she could not breathe properly. She had suspected something, but suspicion was different from proof. She read the details again, hoping her eyes had misunderstood. They had not. What hurt most was not the trip. It was the realization that Calder had looked directly into her eyes every morning while carrying a secret he knew would destroy her. She returned home without confronting him immediately. She sat in the sunroom, where morning light poured across the wooden floor, and remembered the young man she had married. She remembered his worn shoes, his nervous smile, the way he used to thank her for believing in him. She remembered building their first company from a tiny rented office where she had personally cleaned the windows while Calder made sales calls. She remembered sleeping on a second-hand mattress because they had decided every spare dollar should go toward the business. And she wondered when the man she loved had stopped seeing her as his partner and started seeing her as an obstacle. Calder came home around midday expecting an ordinary afternoon. He kissed her casually, placed his briefcase on a chair, and complained about a difficult client. Elowen looked at him carefully. She did not scream. She did not throw anything. She did not ask about Vivian. Instead, she asked whether he was happy with the life they had built. Calder interpreted the question as criticism. He became defensive and accused her of constantly questioning him. Elowen listened quietly as he blamed work, stress, and even her for the distance between them. By the end of the conversation, he had convinced himself that he was the victim. That afternoon, Elowen made a decision. She called the family attorney, Beatrice Langford, and asked her to prepare every financial document connected to the Whitmore estate and business holdings. Beatrice had been waiting years for the day Elowen would finally ask for a complete review. She knew the truth that Calder had forgotten. Almost everything Calder believed he owned was legally connected to Elowen's family trust. The mansion was purchased through one of her holding companies. The primary business had been funded through her trust. The vehicles were registered under corporate entities controlled by her. Several investment accounts were entirely hers. Even Calder's executive position existed because Elowen had placed him there when she created the company's leadership structure. She had never hidden this information from him. She had simply never used it against him. Elowen did not want revenge. She wanted clarity. The next morning, Calder met Vivian at a luxurious daytime restaurant overlooking the city. He was excited because he had decided he would leave Elowen and begin a new life. Vivian encouraged him, telling him that he deserved someone who understood his ambition. Calder believed every word because it matched what he wanted to hear. He told Vivian that the estate was his, that the company was his, and that he could give her everything she wanted. Vivian smiled. But before Calder could finish explaining his plans, his phone began ringing repeatedly. It was the company's chief financial officer. Calder ignored the first call. Then another came. Then another. Finally, he answered. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time it ended, the color had drained from his face. A temporary freeze had been placed on several corporate accounts following instructions from the controlling trustee. Major transactions required authorization from Elowen. Calder laughed nervously, insisting there must have been some mistake. There wasn't. He rushed back to the company, only to discover that Beatrice was already there with Elowen. Employees stood silently as Calder entered the executive conference room. For the first time in years, he saw his wife sitting at the head of the table. She did not look angry. That frightened him more than anger would have. Elowen placed a folder in front of him containing the original financial agreements from 11 years earlier. Calder stared at the documents as memories returned. He remembered signing papers when they started the company, but he had never bothered to read everything carefully. He had assumed the business structure was temporary. Over the years, he had simply assumed the wealth was his because everyone treated him like the owner. Elowen explained that she had never intended to embarrass him or take away his dignity. She had allowed him to lead because she believed marriage meant sharing power. But she had also kept ownership separate because her family's trust had strict legal requirements. Then she told him the one thing he was least prepared to hear. She already knew about Vivian. Calder lowered his eyes. For the first time, there was no clever excuse available to him. He admitted everything. He admitted the lies, the secret meetings, the messages, the planned trip, and his intention to leave Elowen. He admitted that he had become obsessed with being admired. He admitted that he had started believing his own success made him more valuable than the woman who had stood beside him when he had nothing. Elowen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him with tears in her eyes. She told him that the betrayal had not destroyed her because she was stronger than the marriage they had built. What broke her heart was realizing that the man she had trusted had measured her worth by what he thought she owned, while she had measured his worth by who he was when he owned nothing. Calder finally understood. He had not cheated on a wealthy woman. He had betrayed the person who had loved him before wealth ever entered the room. Vivian disappeared from his life almost immediately after learning the truth. The woman who had admired Calder's wealth suddenly had no interest in the man standing before her. That rejection was painful, but it forced Calder to confront an ugly truth. He had been surrounded by people who valued what he could provide because he had spent years becoming someone who valued himself for exactly the same reason. Elowen did not throw Calder out of the company that day. Instead, she removed him from his executive position and required him to step away from the business entirely. She gave him a modest settlement that was fair and legally appropriate, but she refused to allow him access to the fortune he had treated as his personal possession. Then she filed for separation. The following months were difficult for both of them. Calder moved into a small apartment. For the first time in years, he had to manage his own laundry, prepare simple meals, and live without assistance. He sold several unnecessary possessions and began working with a small business mentoring organization. At first, he did it because he wanted to rebuild his image. But slowly, something changed. He began meeting young entrepreneurs who reminded him of himself 11 years earlier. Some had brilliant ideas but no money. Some had failed businesses. Some had families depending on them. Instead of judging them, Calder started helping them. He volunteered at a community business center during the daytime, teaching basic sales and financial planning. He used his experience to help people avoid the mistakes he had made. He stopped telling stories about his success and started telling stories about his failures. Meanwhile, Elowen expanded the foundation she had quietly supported for years. She created programs for struggling families, funded small businesses owned by single parents, and established scholarships for people who had been forced to abandon education because of financial hardship. One afternoon, nearly a year after their separation, Calder arrived at one of the foundation's community centers to deliver donated equipment. He did not know Elowen would be there. She was standing near a group of volunteers, wearing simple clothes and helping organize boxes. When she saw him, neither of them moved for several seconds. Calder looked different. He no longer carried himself like a man who needed everyone to know he was important. His clothes were modest. His expression was calmer. There was humility in his eyes that had not been there before. He told her he had not come to ask for money, forgiveness, or another chance. He simply wanted to thank her. He thanked her for believing in him when he was young. He thanked her for helping him build a life. He apologized for turning her kindness into something he expected. Most importantly, he apologized for betraying her trust. Elowen listened. Then she told him something he would remember forever. Forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and loving someone again was not the same as allowing them to hurt you again. Calder accepted that without argument. Weeks passed. They began speaking occasionally about the foundation. Then about business. Then about ordinary things. There was no sudden romance and no magical repair. Their relationship rebuilt itself slowly, through honesty instead of promises. One spring afternoon, Elowen attended a charity event hosted by the foundation. Calder was there too, not as the owner, not as the executive, and not as her husband. He was simply a volunteer. During the event, a young man approached Calder and thanked him for helping him save his small business. Calder smiled and told him to remember that success meant nothing if you forgot the people who helped you reach it. Elowen heard those words. For the first time in a long time, she smiled at him without sadness. They did not immediately remarry. Instead, they chose something more difficult and more meaningful. They started over. They attended counseling. They learned how to communicate without blame. Calder learned to listen. Elowen learned that forgiveness could exist without surrendering boundaries. Slowly, the bitterness between them became understanding. 2 years later, they renewed their vows in a small daytime ceremony surrounded by family, friends, and several people whose lives had been changed by their foundation. There was no extravagant display. No giant mansion. No cameras. No attempt to prove anything to anyone. Calder stood beside Elowen knowing exactly who had built the life he once took for granted. And Elowen stood beside him knowing that forgiveness had not erased the past. It had simply stopped the past from controlling the future. The greatest twist was that Elowen never needed to destroy Calder to prove she had power. She already had everything. What she chose to do with that power revealed who she truly was. Calder once believed wealth made a person important. Eventually, he learned that wealth could buy comfort, influence, and opportunity, but it could never buy loyalty, trust, or genuine love. And Elowen learned something too. Sometimes forgiveness is not about giving someone back the place they once occupied in your life. Sometimes forgiveness is simply releasing the anger so you can walk forward without carrying the weight of what they did. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before the story ends, leave a meaningful comment telling us what lesson touched you most. Was it Calder's betrayal, Elowen's strength, or the power of forgiveness and second chances? Because in the end, Calder lost the fortune he thought made him powerful, but he gained something money had never been able to give him: humility. And Elowen discovered that sometimes the greatest victory is not watching the person who hurt you suffer. It is becoming so strong, so peaceful, and so full of purpose that their betrayal can no longer define your life. The woman he betrayed owned everything he thought made him powerful, but she never used that power to destroy him. She used it to teach him what he had forgotten, that a person's true wealth is measured not by what they possess, but by the love they protect, the people they help, and the character they choose when nobody is watching.